Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri. All of us at FPRI, thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI webpage. It's a pleasure to have you with us. After reading Whittaker Chambers's harrowing memoir, Witness, French intellectual giant André Malraux said to the author, "You did not return from hell with empty hands." Chambers saw terrible things and suffered much, but turned that experience into reflective wisdom, infused with the spirit of tragedy that haunts all human lives. Robert Kaplan has visited many modern versions of hell, turning what he has seen and experienced into a library of thoughtful and challenging books. He also has not returned with empty hands, but with insights to help us better understand this world. This spring, he has distilled the lessons of a life spent in pursuit of tragic knowledge into a new book, The Tragic Mind: Fear, Fate, and the Burden of Power, from Yale University Press. Kaplan's brief essay is both a personal and a professional meditation in which he relates his own experiences to larger historical examples to understand the meaning of tragedy, or as he puts it, to argue for thinking tragically to avoid tragedy. Because tragic thinking, Kaplan argues, should not lead to passivity, and understanding the tragedy of the world can help us to avoid the worst outcomes. In pure tragedy, he writes, struggle always has a purpose, a chance. Tragedy is not fatalism, nor is it despair. It is comprehension. In a little over a dozen short chapters written in an aphoristic style that begs quotation, Kaplan draws on a lifetime of reading, from Greek tragedies to Nietzsche, to Conrad, to Dostoevsky, with special attention to Shakespeare. His thoughts range from the individual responsibilities of leaders to the broader tension between order and anarchy. The hardest decisions, he concludes, are not between good and evil, but between goods. The goal, overall, is to encourage humility in leaders who have to make those decisions. Leaders should understand the limits of their knowledge and the limits of their ability to defy fate. Kaplan's essay does not shy away from contemporary resonances. American foreign policy over the past decades has been anything but humble, and the results, from Afghanistan to Iraq, have been horrible. Perhaps a tragic sensibility, he suggests, can help us avoid such horrible events in the future. For an essay built on classic text, Kaplan is also relentless in his criticism of intellectuals and elites. It is much easier, he writes, to be an intellectual or an artist or a journalist than to be a king or a political leader. Only those who have never experienced war have the luxury of advocating it with a clean conscience. He makes several references to the dangers of disorder and to an old Persian proverb that 1 year of anarchy is worth 100 years of tyranny, is worse than 100 years of tyranny, I should say. Kaplan can thus be charged sometimes with showing some sympathy for the devil if the devil is acting responsibly to maintain order. That's something we'll have to discuss today, and there is a lot to discuss in this short book. So what does it mean to think tragically? Can we escape fate by being aware of fate's power? How should we balance human desire for freedom with human need for order? How can the literature of the past help us think about the future? These questions and yours will guide us in our conversation with Robert Kaplan. Robert Kaplan is the Robert Strauss Houpé Chair in Geopolitics at FPRI. He was twice named one of the world's top 100 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine. A reporter with decades of experience writing for The Atlantic, he has written 21 books, including Adriatic, The Good American, The Revenge of Geography, and Asia's Cauldron. He has served on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and on the U.S. Navy's executive panel, and we are delighted to consider him a colleague here at FPRI and to welcome him today. Welcome to People, Politics, and Prose, Bob Kaplan.
Well, thank you, Ron. With that introduction, maybe there's not much left for me to say. I'm not sure, but thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm sure we'll think of something, Bob. I have a lot of faith in you here.
Yeah.
And we also encourage you out there in the audience to remember to use the Q&A feature to come in with questions of your own. But I want to start you off, Bob, with the question of what led you to write this book at this time?
Well, it was several things, Ron. One was my experience in Iraq, where I thought I had experienced the worst, absolute worst political situation imaginable by going there several times under Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. I said, what could be worse than this? Nothing could be worse than this. And as a result, I supported the Iraq War. And then when I went back embedded first with US Marines in 2004, and then with the US Army Stryker Brigade in 2005, I experienced something worse than this. I experienced anarchy, you know? Yeah. And I said, what could be worse than this? Well, I discovered what could be worse than this. And, you know, these questions of tyranny versus anarchy, it's a dismal subject. It's been dealt with by the great philosophers from Plato to Hobbes. But to learn about it but through actually lived, intense experience is life-changing. Yeah. You know, it's life-changing. So that was one thing that encouraged me to write the book. The other was a colleague in Washington who just had the mundane statement, Bob, you keep saying you have to think tragically in order to avoid tragedy. That's a short book, you know? You know? Right. So, you know, that was the lesser reason. And so what I do in this book is I introduce the Iraq War in the opening, in the prologue, and go back to it in a much later chapter. But essentially, the book is not about Iraq. It launches into a discussion of the lessons of the ancient Greek tragedians, of Shakespeare, and of modern literature that is very Greek and Shakespearean in its texture, such as books by Joseph Conrad, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and especially Herman Melville, the American, and Albert Camus and others. So, you know, it launches from Iraq into a whole discussion of what is tragedy. And what I discovered is it's much different than what people think it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm glad that's the great place to continue here, because you talk about what does it mean to have a tragic sensibility, and that and you do talk a lot about sort of what tragedy is and is not, right? The tragedy is not, it's not everything's not terrible. It's just that, but it's something more than that. And,
yes.
And so let's talk about that. What is your sense of what's a tragic sensibility?
Yeah. First of all, what tragedy is not. Mm-hmm. Tragedy is not common misfortune or things going wrong, because this is the rule of life. This happens to anyone who's lived long enough. You know, the mundane difficulties and sorrows are not really what tragedy is about. Nor is tragedy about vile crimes, vast and vile crimes like the Holocaust or Rwanda or Bosnia. The Greeks had no answer for things like this, essentially. They didn't deal with it. So I've sort of written evil out of the book. There's really not that much about evil in the book at all, because what tragedy really is comprehension, about realizing the situation you're in when it's too late to affect the outcome. You finally achieve wisdom, but it's too late. And we all go through that, and all great leaders go through that, and they churn in their sleep at night, are unable to sleep because of this bad decision or that bad decision. Tragedy is about a contest between goods, not between good and evil, between one good over another good that causes suffering, essentially. So simplistically put, removing a leader who's a vast human rights, a leader guilty of vast evil, and removing him is a good in and of itself. But if it leads to a situation where even more people are killed through anarchy once order is removed, that's that's another good. Not to allow that to happen. So, for instance, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is one of the greatest realists in American history, supported with massive amounts of American taxpayers' dollars aid to the mass murderer Joseph Stalin in order to defeat the mass murderer Adolf Hitler. So, that's a tragic sensibility, in a sense. It's about, it's about realizing that, well, as Henry Kissinger wrote in his first book when he was in his 20s, statesmanship which is a sense of tragedy, is balancing what is just with what is possible.
Mhm.
And what is just depends on your own moral thinking and that of the country you represent. What is possible depends also on the moral thinking or lack thereof of countries half a world away and how they are governed. So that, as I write in the book, journalists and intellectuals, many of them have it easy in life because they can just write about doing what is just. The person in power, and the people around the person in power wearing 3 laminated badges around their necks in the halls of government, they don't have that luxury. They also have to deal with what is possible.
What is possible? Yeah, and there's 2 directions I want to take with this. Is one, you point out, you make reference to the fact that when you talk about the moral sense of different countries, that it is something of a cliche, but that doesn't mean it is incorrect to say that Americans have a hard time with the concept of a tragic sensibility, right? In a land of unlimited possibility, in a land of sort of, let's say, sometimes shallow historical understanding, and always looking to the future, Americans struggle with the idea that things might not always work out for the best. What do you think? Is it possible that the Americans are learning a tragic sensibility based on what has happened, or what do we need to do in order to cultivate a tragic sensibility in our public?
Well, first of all, the American South has had a tragic sensibility. If you look at the works of Faulkner and Agee and others, because they've seen war on their soil and they've experienced defeat, humiliating defeat. So if you look at authors like William Faulkner and Shelby Foote, you see a significant amount of tragic thinking or a tragic sensibility. But your larger point is correct. Americans are children of geography, protected by 2 oceans, with an inland freshwater, with an inland river system that is larger than those of the rest of the world combined to transport goods and make an American nation in the course of the 19th century across the Midwest and the heartland. So remember, America was the only major country which after World War II did not have its infrastructure severely damaged or destroyed. And it was that fact, that almost negative benefit, that gave rise to so much American power in the 50s, 60s, 70s, into the 80s, essentially. So that it is difficult for Americans to learn a tragic sensibility. Americans tend to think that their history, the successful history of a mass democracy, up until recently, I would argue, has more relevance to Iraq or Egypt or many places than those countries' own histories. When Americans say we can turn Egypt into a democracy or Egypt should be a democracy, that's like saying that our history is more important than Egypt's, even though Egypt is the country we're talking about here.
Right.
So there's that. But I think going on in your question, that the more that technology shrinks the world and shrinks technology, oceans protect us less. And there are so many examples of that, from cybercrime to disease spreads, with COVID and all of that. That America will no longer have the benefit of splendid isolation, and will develop a tragic sensibility. The reason the Europeans developed it, remember, is because they were all squeezed together on a small part of the long peninsula of the Eurasian supercontinent, the Western Peninsula,
Right.
and they were right up against each other. And because they were right up against each other, they had less of a margin for mistakes. And with less of a margin for mistakes, they developed a tragic sensibility. America has a great margin for mistakes still.
Right.
mistakes like Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq would immobilize or ruin a middle level or small power. But Americans can basically shrug it off,
Right. Well, and that we have, right? I mean,
Yes.
is itself just, it's a fascinating question, right? The idea is, that's why I'm wondering, how will we learn? When will we learn a tragic sensibility if we haven't already, right? One would hope that we wouldn't have to suffer the same kind of crushing, humiliating defeat that, say, the Germans suffered in 1945 or the Japanese, before we learned a tragic sensibility. I guess that's what I struggle with, is the idea of if Afghanistan and Iraq don't help us to get there, what's it going to take?
Again, we live in a world now where, remember, the Cold War was mainly peaceful, except in the Third World, where all the bloody battles really were. But the Cold War was peaceful in North America and Europe and the Far East generally. Well, not so peaceful in the Far East, but generally peaceful because everyone was afraid of hydrogen bombs. Remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis totally spooked out not just us, but the Soviets.
Right.
And because of that, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had hotlines and strategic arms limitation talks, and ultimately détente. All that emerged from the fear that was inculcated in Washington and Moscow as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nowadays, though, and the reason is that hydrogen bombs are the kind of weapon that was built not to be used, whereas now you have a whole new range of mini, small tactical nuclear weapons with low radiation yields that are in fact built to be used. And then you have precision guided missiles, hypersonic missiles. You have a whole new array of lethal, destructive, terrifying weaponry, which it is conceivable to actually use, and which we do use, or our adversaries have used. So the chances of a disaster or something are very real. The Biden administration has come under criticism from the Wilsonian liberal internationalists, essentially, for not giving enough weapons fast enough to Ukraine.
Right.
All right. On the other hand, they've been criticized by the right, the paleocon isolationists, for doing anything about Ukraine. But the criticism from the Wilsonian internationalists is much more interesting, because the problem is that the Biden administration, I think, may have gotten it right. It's thinking tragically. It's slow moving the weapon shipment, because there's a very constructive argument going on in the Pentagon for each weapon system and each delivery, which there needs to be. It's a result of tragic thinking,
right.
So to speak, because it's actually a policy of strict limits, because it seeks to avoid spreading the war to NATO, and it seeks to avoid Putin using small scale nuclear weapons or other forms of WMD. And yet at the same time, it seeks to arm Ukraine to the hilt in order to weaken and weaken and weaken a rival great power. So it may have gotten the mix right. We don't know yet. Only time will tell. But so far, I think it's an example of tragic thinking.
Mm-hmm. I mean,
without being immobilized by
it, right? Because that's what I think is that idea. There's a quote which I, once upon a time, when professors used to have quotations taped to their door, I used to have a quotation taped to my door, which I was trying to track down for this conversation, and it's a comment from Tocqueville, where he says, we need to watch and ward for the future, and be humble about it, not in a way that enervates us or makes us afraid to act, but one that makes us strive to be more wise in the actions we take. And that's this issue of, when do we know when we made the right decision or not, right? Afghanistan is famous for this, because what we thought was a smart decision of arming the Mujahideen against the Soviets turns out to be not so smart when some of those same radicals end up attacking us. But this idea about how we know, when we know, and what do we do once we know, goes back to something you talk about in the book about your work on the Balkans. Right.
Mm.
When you wrote Balkan Ghosts, and you highlighted the depth of the disagreements, the to use the catchphrase, ancient hatreds, that kind of argument was used to justify taking no action for many years in the West. Right. The idea was people threw up their hands and said, "Oh, these people hate each other. What can we do about it?" You are very honest in The Tragic Mind that use of your work sort of was a disappointment because it got in the way of different policy choices. What do we do with the knowledge when we find out that perhaps either we got something wrong or we misinterpreted the evidence in ways that led to policy decisions that we regret? How should we deal with regret as a part of a tragic sensibility?
Yes. First of all, I did not use the term ancient hatred.
Right, you didn't, right? It gets hung on you, I know, a lot, but you didn't say it. Yeah.
I used ancient and hatreds in different forms, talking about the Romans and others, but not in the way that it's been alleged. And I, as far as I was concerned, I did my job. In other words, I reported throughout the 1980s, interviewed hundreds of people, not just in the former Yugoslavia, but in Romania, Bulgaria. And I had a book that was excerpted not only before the war started, but before the Berlin Wall even fell, and before the crisis that led to the fall of the Berlin Wall had even started, warning about war in the Balkans. Right. So I did my job. The problem was, books can be used in whatever fashion they are, an author cannot control it, And what I said was, this is the grimmest human landscape imaginable. But guess what? It's only grim human landscapes where intervention is ever required in the first place. And to deny that is not to be realistic. So, what really enraged me was not my critics. It was President Clinton himself in the early part of his term, who wanted to see a region through rose-colored glasses before he would take action, essentially. But, if there's a distinction, and I'm splitting hairs here, between guilt and remorse, I suffered no guilt because of Balkan Ghosts, because I believe that I did my job. But I do have remorse for how the book was used. Yeah. And for the delay in taking action. Now, you could spin all kind of counterfactuals about this was in his first weeks as president. Had Clinton intervened then, and this was when the war was still raging, it could have been a catastrophe. By the time he intervened in 95, the war was actually winding down due to our surreptitious aid to the Croats, which even the tables with the Serbs, and the war really wound down, So when U.S. forces or NATO forces intervened, there wasn't really as much fighting as in 95 as there had been in 93. Sure. All that counterfactuals are the crack cocaine of our business, So all of what I mean to say is, that's all very interesting. Yeah. But the fact is, we have to live with what we've got. So I will forever have deep remorse, because of the way that book was used. In foreign policy, you never really get it right, because even a policy that works for 2 decades or so can then be the cause of something 3 decades later that happens, and then everyone calls the work of the decision of failure, kind of. In other words, helping to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. And there's a lot of excellent revisionist history on this that we really misunderstand what happened. But nevertheless, the fact that we helped topple him and bring back the Shah, it actually worked for 25 years, and it was seen as a successful policy. Well, time goes on, the Shah governed not very well, though he did some good things, the White Revolution, all of that. And then he gets cancer. And at the time he gets weak and he has cancer, the Islamic Revolution occurs, and he cannot respond because he is physically decimated.
Right.
And everyone blames our decision about Mossadegh then, you see.
Yeah.
So that's foreign policy.
Right. No, it's a fascinating point, right? Because obviously, especially when people are writing books about contemporary events, and there is the huge temptation to be able to reach back into the past, rummage through the trunk, and find an event from the past that perhaps people today don't remember, and say, aha, this explains everything. This is the skeleton key. And here I'm gonna sell lots of books by pointing out that this event that nobody remembers. But that larger point that you make, that which is worth reflecting on, is how long does a policy have to succeed for it to be considered a success? And when do we get to the point where we can say, okay, whatever happens from now it can't be traced back to that thing, however far back. That we're going to continue to struggle with that, I am afraid. Joe Della Penna has a question that comes in on the Q&A, which I encourage other people to use. And he says, an editorial in today's Guardian introduces another tragic dimension to the Iraq invasion, namely that the post-truth society began with the Iraq invasion. Obviously, I haven't read the piece he's talking about in the Guardian, and I doubt that you have either. But at least today. But this issue that what Iraq has done to undermine lots of people's faith in any kind of political truth, the sense of that there were false pretenses or misunderstandings, that's led a lot of people into a lot of very profound criticisms of not only criticisms of the people who made the decisions, but also a willingness to disbelieve all decision makers. What do you think about that? How do we get back to a sense of truth?
This actually goes back to the Vietnam War, Ron.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because up until Vietnam, Americans trusted government. After all, government had got them through the Great Depression. It had gotten them through World War II, and it was on the brink of putting a man on the moon, the space program. So government delivered. The Vietnam War shattered the faith in government, for a generation of Americans, essentially. After that, there was no more establishment, so to speak. No more wise men. All that went with the Vietnam War, and Iraq is another level of this. Iraq was not fought for oil. That's nonsense. It was fought because, the ostensible reason was that Saddam Hussein may not have had relations with Al-Qaeda, but he had relations with every other Middle East terrorist group. He was shooting at the pilots flying the no-fly zone. This could not go on forever. And he had WMD. Or was thought he had, and if he didn't have it, he would reconstitute his program the second he got it. That was what was in policymakers' minds. Because remember, 9/11, the anthrax scare, the fact that 2002 was a big year for terrorism, the Bali incident, the Intifada in Israel, all made the Bush administration fear that we cannot take chances. It's better to err on the side of action. Now, that's up to a point defensible. But, the way the public digests these things is they told us there was WMD and there wasn't. Therefore, we can't trust government, so to speak. So Iraq has added another layer on top of Vietnam in terms of, of not being able to trust government, and which is a shame, really, because these things are incredibly hard to decide, what to do. I think I wouldn't call it a crime. The real mistake in Iraq was not to plan for the post-invasion.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess that's when I think about a tragic sensibility, right, or a lack of humility, right? I think about Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld having he had a point to make about how efficiently one could do the military operation, and he had a point to make that he wasn't interested in the politics afterwards, and that he felt like he could do his part of the job and leave the other things to somebody else. and the assumption that everybody seemed to allow themselves to be carried away with the notion that success would take care of itself. That lack of humility is that cost an awful lot of lives.
Yeah, it did. It did, and it's had its effect.
Mhm.
I think it's had its effect in Syria, not so much in Libya, because Iraq was destroyed and we went ahead and destroyed Libya, essentially. Iraq was an original mistake. In the sense that was the first time, a first world army tried to occupy a complex Islamic society. And it turned out that armies can do a lot of things, but that's one thing it cannot do. Right. Libya, though, was a derivative, unoriginal mistake, because we had the example with Iraq. See, in Libya was also a side reason why I wrote this book, because if the American elite couldn't say, gee, Iraq was a disaster, we shouldn't repeat these things, we shouldn't be intervening in the Islamic world, we shouldn't be toppling regimes there, at least, without really mapping things out. And after all the people supporting toppling Gaddafi in Libya, even though Iraq was still almost a hot war in 2011, showed me that there's something about a Washington sensibility.
Yeah.
A sensibility that our history matters more than yours. And because we've had such a good experience with mass democracy, you will too, essentially. And keep in mind that the reason America had such a wonderful experience with mass democracy is that the system was invented by pessimists with a deep tragic sensibility, the
Indeed.
Founders. I mean, to read the Federalist Papers, which I go through in my book, is an exercise in tragic thinking. Right. They're sourpuss aristocrats obsessed with everything that could go wrong. They fear anarchy, but they also fear too much order, and they also have a very low opinion of human nature. And you see this in Hamilton and Madison, in the various Federalist Papers. And because they were so pessimistic, they invented a system that actually worked, that avoided the worst, and it led to a population of optimists.
Right. Oddly enough.
Yeah, at least throughout what I call the greater print and typewriter age. Mm-hmm. Once you got to the digital video era, starting in the later part of the 20th century, the end of the 20th century, then one could argue that maybe American democracy in the digital video era will not be as successful as it was.
It's a possibility. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Because you're right. The founders in the Federalists, right, they're very specific, right? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If we were governed by angels, there would be no need to worry about constitutions either. But instead, we know we're not angels, and we're going to govern ourselves. And even with the good system they put together, right, that didn't stop us from having a civil war.
Yeah.
Right. And so, this is what I've been thinking about this, because especially you mentioned Libya, right? Is that some people's lesson from Libya was, well, Iraq turned out to be so terrible because we stationed a lot of troops there. So we're going to do this without stationing any troops there and see if it works out better. So we'll overthrow the government and then leave the Libyans to their own devices, as though that's going to make things better. It reminds me of an old joke about two people who went to go see the movie The Lost Weekend, and they both had been heavy drinkers. And they come out and the one guy says to the other, well, this really makes you think, doesn't it? I don't think I'm going to drink again. And the other one says, yeah, it made me think too. I'm not going to the movies ever again.
Yeah. Libya, like Iraq, was an artificial country. Mm. Western Libya was always oriented towards Greater Tunisia. Yeah. And Eastern Libya, Cyrenaica, was always oriented towards Alexandria, to Greater Alexandria in Egypt. So it wasn't a real country in the sense that Tunisia and Egypt are age-old clusters of civilization and statehood, as Iraq was not a real country. And remember, we couldn't govern Iraq initially because we had too few troops there.
No, and yeah, and I guess yeah, the idea about when we talk about learning lessons from history, it all depends on who's doing the reading, whose history they're choosing, and what lessons people want to hear. Which gets to the one of the real I won't say a book on tragedy has joys in it necessarily, but one of the real joys of your essay is that you really break a lance in favor of the idea that if we want to understand the world, that we need to engage with literature. And we need to engage with, specifically with the classics, but just that we need to go beyond social science theorizing, right? You even say that literary classics will ultimately be firmer guides for policy than any social science methodology, which as a humanist of I think that's terrific. And yet we run into an interesting problem that these days, when people talk about education, when they talk about higher education, the idea is that the humanities are considered to be an unnecessary luxury. For political reasons, people are hostile to them, or for practical reasons, they say, students should be out there learning STEM. They shouldn't be spending their time reading novels. How can we talk about the value of literary knowledge and the value of what literature can bring us in a way that can enrich our education of the public, right? Not just students in school, but even of Americans today.
Sorry to say, Ron, that even if you took a full load of humanities courses today, you wouldn't encounter the writers that I talk about.
This is a problem.
Because the teaching has become so politicized that these ancient classics are no longer taught. And by ancient classics, I don't just mean the Greeks and Shakespeare. I mean, the great 19th century novelists like Melville and Hawthorne, and others. And so, even then, it's not really it's not really taught. Interestingly, the best courses and students that I've encountered have been at military war colleges, where there's no politics, where you can encounter these authors directly, and most of the students have some actual lived experience with war and conflict. There was an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal a week ago about how great the students are in prisons.
Mm-hmm.
That the best place to teach now is in prison, because the students are really receptive to all of this, and they're not distracted by smartphones, because they're not allowed to have them, essentially. So this is, Edith Hamilton, who I write about in the book, who is one of the great American classicists of the early mid-20th century. I think, I'm 70 and I grew up reading her book, The Myth, Greek mythology, which is, mythology. Edith Hamilton said that there are 4 great tragic writers in history, and 3 of them are Greek. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And the 4th, of course, she said, was Shakespeare.
Right.
Right. And so it's with those 4 that that you begin. And everything devolves from those 4. I mean, Melville's novella, Billy Budd, is very Greek.
Yes.
It's very biblical in a way. It's about taking a life, a young, innocent life, in order to preserve order on a ship in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. And let me mention a point about order and anarchy, if
Please.
I may. It's very interesting, Ron. The people who have contacted me, who are the most enthusiastic about this book, are fellow foreign correspondents. And the reason is, there's a problem with anarchy. The elite, the intellectual elite in America, in other places, they know all about dictatorship and authoritarianism because they read about it in the newspaper every day. And they live in a world of ideas, and the battle of ideas, and authoritarians suppress ideas. So their worst fear is authoritarianism. But foreign correspondents in many places, Latin America, Africa, elsewhere, have experienced something worse, anarchy. So they know exactly what I'm talking about here when I say anarchy is worse than tyranny, because it's part of their lived experience. You see, and it's something you cannot communicate unless you've actually experienced it. So what separates people or separates me from others is not so much intellectual, it's my life experience, my life work experience. I was speaking to a German journalist recently who said that he was in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was toppled, and he went with a mob to ransack the home of the former foreign minister at that point, Tariq Aziz. And the mob was stealing and breaking everything. And suddenly, my colleague, this German correspondent, had a total sense of fear because it was very violent and there were no police around because the police had disappeared. The regime had collapsed. There was nothing. There was nothing, and he was in the midst of a mob, which may have been doing something understandable, destroying the home of an oppressive person. But, he said after that experience, it changed his thinking about anarchy,
Yeah. Well, and I like the way you put that too, that, people in a free society are more concerned about having their freedom taken away by someone in authority. They don't necessarily think about the loss of freedom that would come with anarchy, because many of these people are entranced by the idea that if only they could maximize their freedom, then everybody would be better off. But that always assumes that there's some larger framework that's maintaining authority, right? That's allowing them to get from their fancy apartments to Starbucks and back. And I think that's one of those interesting questions about how we construct a political order. And that might also be something very American as well, as we tend to forget how much effort goes into creating order instead of imagining that it is somehow spontaneously generated from the will of individuals. I've got a couple questions here. I see one from Fritz Heinzen, and it was one I wanted to ask you as well. And that is, Fritz says, right, as someone who's benefited from Robert Kaplan's books, I'd love to hear his book and author recommendations for foreign policy, national security policymakers needing to cultivate a tragic sensibility. And so you mentioned Billy Budd, which I'm delighted you did, because I think it's tragically underappreciated. But what of the pieces of literature in particular that you either mention or don't mention in the book itself that you would say you really, to help to cultivate that tragic sensibility, you should take a look at?
You should read Albert Camus' The Rebel.
The Rebel.
Yeah, which is about the moral responsibility of people who rebel against authority to have planned out a replacement before they revolt. Revolt is intrinsic to the human experience. Ever since ever since people revolted against Zeus's authority, in ancient Greece, revolt has been part of humanity. But the rebel has the responsibility not just to topple the existing order, but to think through a replacement to it. And this was very radical when Camus wrote this. First of all, it's a very readable book, by the way. I can tell you, it's extremely readable. It's, along with The Plague, it's his best book, And this was very radical when Camus came up with this, because he was basically saying that order is more important than anarchy, essentially. And for a French intellectual to say that at the time was very, it was quite daring, so that's one book. The other is to read a number of books in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Red Wheel series about the Russian Revolution, a series of novels. And the main takeaway there is that the real tragedy was the overthrow of the Tsar. We tend to think of the Tsar as evil, anti-Semitic, all these things. All these things were true, but the Tsar was the only figure of authority. And once you toppled the Romanov dynasty, you had absolute anarchy in the country, of which the interim leaders like Alexander Kerensky were barely able to deal with. And it was because of the depth of that anarchy that the Bolsheviks were able to stage the coup and go on and mass murder tens of millions of people. So, you know, had the Romanovs not been toppled, think this through. Russia today would be a constitutional monarchy, very imperfect, very corrupt, with an on-again, off-again friendship with the West, but it would not have become the totalitarian monster that it became in the course of the 20th century under Lenin and Stalin and ultimately Putin. Because Putin's the character of his rule goes back to communism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so even though people like to use Tsarist terminology to describe Putin, Putin is certainly he has much more, he draws much more on communist traditions than he does on any Tsarist traditions.
He certainly does. He has more power than any leader in the Kremlin since Stalin.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I guess that is going to be the ongoing. I mean, you talked about how counterfactuals are the crack cocaine of our business, so we couldn't resist that particular counterfactual. It does raise interesting questions, and this gets to Tom's Trop has a question that also a counterfactual of sorts, and that is we talk about the palpable fear in Iraq under Saddam, contrasting that with the mere tyranny but not terror under Hafez al-Assad in Syria. Was it worth experiencing the anarchy after Saddam in order to arrive at today's Iraq, where there is disorder and corruption, but not terror? This because you're the question of, you know, how long does a policy have to be a good idea for it to stay good, but also if toppling Saddam was a bad idea, but if the result is an Iraq that is not as terrible as it was under Saddam, how do we understand the direction of,
you know, in 2005, I was a reporter embedded with a U.S. Army Stryker Brigade combat team in Mosul. This is November, December 2005. And the city was in fair disorder, but we were able to go, but they were just starting to implement, you know, helping the population. And we went house to house, the army, just showing the flag, saying, we're here, is there anything you need? And I asked people, is it worse now than under Saddam? And they said much worse, because under Saddam, at least things were predictable. Under you could predict your life, you can organize a life around the nature of the regime. Things worked, they were on time, electricity functioned, water ran, there was order in the streets, etc. Now there was nothing, you know. In other words, the idea that you've held a few elections in Iraq, well, that sounds good, you know, but how long did it take to form a government after each election? 8, 9 months in some cases. Does the government really govern? I was in northern Iraq, the Kurdish part, just last year, and there were quite a few people I met who had gone to Baghdad, you know, and they said, don't go, it's unsafe, you'd be kidnapped at the airport. There's no security because the government doesn't govern. You know, the government does not monopolize the use of force. Various militias do. Whereas Kurdistan was one of the most corrupt places I've ever been, but there was order. You were safe. You know, you could go out to a restaurant alone, walk back at night, or take a taxi back at night. There was basically order. The reason Kurdistan is not improved economically to become like, you know, Malaysia or Vietnam is complicated. It's partly because it's so corrupt. It's a cash society. Nobody uses credit cards and you can't trace cash. And it's also because it's bounded on all sides by essential enemies, you know, which restrict it a lot. And there are quite a few other reasons, but Kurdistan is paradise compared to the other 2/3 of Iraq.
Well, and that gets to a point that, and also this is part of the question from Murray Levin, but also related to something that you talked about in the book. You talk about in the book is politics needs to be about choosing between goods. We should not assume that there are struggles between good and evil. And this gets to the let's say the classic realist political question is what role should anybody's ideals play in making political choices. You've already made the point that one should not assume that one's own history is going to trump the history of the country that you're involving in. But what should we do? What should we in the United States do about our, say, ideals about human rights in the way that we deal with both enemies and with friends? Especially like right now, the news is all about how one of our not friends, the Chinese, have gotten together with one of our adversaries, the Iranians, and one of our semi-friends, the Saudis, to make a deal. And the larger feeling is that they were able to make this deal together, the three of them, because they didn't have the Americans there to talk a whole lot of stuff about democracy and human rights that just gets in the way. What should we do about those ideals?
Yeah, well, I was in Saudi Arabia last year for several weeks, and people said to me, the Chinese come with money. They come with investment, and they don't come with lectures about human rights in this. You know, your democracy has worked well for several hundred years, but you didn't, you know, you didn't have civil rights until the mid-60s. You know, women were not liberated completely until about them, you know, that, you know, and we never questioned you. Don't question us. That was the line I got from the Saudis a year ago, and don't make us choose between the Chinese and us by, you know, by harping about how we should organize our system of governance. Because from the Saudi point of view, they've had several changes of leadership over the last 100 years. All went smoothly, peaceful. There was one assassination, but within 48 hours, there was a new leader who was very good. So the same family has ruled. It's been partially meritocratic, because it doesn't just go from father to son, etc. And they've looked around and they've seen the destruction of Libya, the destruction of Egypt, the destruction of Iraq, the destruction of Yemen, which started with the Arab Spring, by the way, before the Civil War, the destruction of Syria. And they said, don't give us any lectures. You know, don't lecture us about democracy. We have a system that works, where there is a social contract between ruler and ruled, you know, in terms of, which tends to work. So how should we think about these things? We should think about the second part of young Kissinger's dictum. What is possible, you know, and, you know, in each given society. All the Arab Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia are autocratic, but the autocrats rule generally, you know, they've provided development. You know, they've provided, you know, basic minimal freedoms, just not the freedom to vote, you know, essentially. So, and the systems work, and there's a basic social contract. If that's the case, you can't impose your own values. We should not be thinking about exporting democracy, but we should be thinking of exporting better versions of civil society. And civil society does not necessarily have to be democratic. It could mean protection of minorities, lots of things like that. You know, human rights is something we should bring up at the table of discussions, but we should not be number one. We should not impose it.
Well, yeah, and I guess, you know, part of the tragic sensibility is understanding there are things that you can change and things that you have to, or that if any change is going to come, it's going to take much longer. And so
Exactly.
it means, so it's being patient is important.
Yeah,
So
Edmund Burke was the great conservative thinker because he believed in pacing. He believed in gradual change. And
Right.
That's why he was appalled at the French Revolution.
That's true. Well, we are just about out of time. There's a couple of questions left. I don't think we can get to all of them, but you mentioned a little bit, because Carlos Rivers asks about technology and its impact on the future of culture and society and foreign policy. And you've talked a little bit about this, right? That we see and hear a lot more about what goes on other places than we did in the past, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we can control it. And technology can give the individual the illusion of individual power, but there is the remembrance that somebody's got to make sure that the electricity is actually running, and that they can actually get where they're going. Something we talk about as we watch a winter storm rage around us, even as we record this. So what role can or should our understanding of technology play in the way we think about the way society may change and develop going into the future?
Well, technology, because of the new technology, truth, speeches, faces, words can be manipulated, and seem real. So the Guardian is worried about Iraq leading into a post-truth society, something which began with Vietnam and built up through Iraq, but now is technology. Essentially, by the and this leads to a very dark vista of destroying reputations of all kinds of things that can happen. So more than ever, I would argue, in an age of technology, you need the fortifying wisdom of the classics.
Which is a very good place for us to bring this conversation back to the end. And so one place to start is taking a look at The Tragic Mind by Robert D. Kaplan, as Bob talks about the authors that inspired him. Bob, we could go on and on, but this has been a great conversation. Thanks so much for joining us to talk about your book.
Thank you, Ron. Thanks, everybody.
That's right. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Remember, the Tragic Mind is available in bookstores now. FPRI thanks our sponsors and partners for their generous support for programs like this. And we ask you to consider, if you are not currently a sponsor, partner, member of FPRI, that you consider becoming one, so that you can help us to continue conversations like this one. Because even though this conversation is over, this is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we are always here to discuss it at FPRI. If you've enjoyed our discussion today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time when we gather to analyze our complex world. To keep up with future episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. It's been delightful to have you with us, but until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.